The dining room felt colder than usual, not because of the temperature, but because of the way the silence clung to the walls. The smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans filled the air, but it did little to warm the atmosphere. Plates were full, yet no one was really eating with joy. The only sound came from the soft clinking of silverware and the occasional cough or murmur from one of the children. It was Sunday night, the supposed family dinner, but the unity the name suggested had long faded into habit. Ethan sat in the middle, flanked by his older sister Emily on the left and his younger brother Noah on the right. Their parents, Richard and Susan, sat at each end of the table, their postures rigid, their eyes barely meeting. Richard, the patriarch, had just returned from another successful week at his firm, and he was already halfway through boasting about Emily's latest internship interview. "She's got the head for finance. That's how you move forward in this world," he said, his voice booming with pride. Emily smirked, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. She didn't need the affirmation. She had always received it. Noah, only 14, looked amused as he stabbed his potatoes, listening passively. But Ethan remained still, his fork untouched, his eyes focused on a small scratch in the wooden table, tracing it absent-mindedly with his thumb. The air around him was heavier than the rest of the room, as if his presence alone absorbed any remnants of joy. Then Ethan cleared his throat. It was barely audible, but enough to disrupt the flow of Richard's voice. "Actually, I've been working on something too," he said, looking up at his father, his tone quiet but hopeful. "It's a tech project, a device I've been building. I think it could really—" "You," Richard interrupted, lowering his glass mid-sip. His expression shifted instantly from detached to annoyed, his eyebrows raising slightly as if what he just heard was absurd. "You're the most useless son in this house." The words didn't land like an explosion. They landed like a verdict. Final, cold, unflinching. The silence that followed was more brutal than the insult itself. Emily exhaled a sharp breath through her nose, the ghost of a laugh escaping. Susan didn't look up. She kept cutting her meat, pretending nothing had happened. Noah froze but said nothing. Ethan stared at his father for a moment. His expression didn't change, nor did he look away. He wasn't angry, not visibly. His eyes just held a kind of quiet clarity, the kind that only comes from someone who's heard this kind of thing before, maybe not in the same words, but with the same meaning. Then he smiled, a small, contained smile. Not the smile of someone who was amused or defeated or bitter. It was the kind of smile someone gives right before they decide they've had enough. Without another word, Ethan stood. He picked up his napkin, folded it slowly, and placed it on the table beside his untouched plate. He didn't rush. He didn't slam anything. He simply walked around the table, passed behind his father's chair, and headed for the front door. "Where are you going?" Susan asked, finally looking up. Ethan paused at the doorway, not turning around. "Out," he said softly. "You haven't even eaten," she added, her voice flat. "I'm not hungry." Richard scoffed but didn't speak. Noah watched Ethan as if he were watching a scene from a movie, confused, curious, but distant. Emily smirked again, this time more awkwardly. "Drama much?" she mumbled, just loud enough for Susan to hear. But Susan said nothing, and the door closed before Ethan could have heard it. Outside, the night greeted him with silence and cool air. It was just past 7 o'clock in the evening. The street was quiet, suburban lights casting long shadows over empty sidewalks. Ethan walked without checking his phone, without any plan. He wasn't storming out. He was simply removing himself from the table, a table where he never really had a seat. As he turned the corner at the end of the street, he took one last glance back at the house. The windows glowed faintly, but to Ethan, they might as well have been blank walls. Whatever warmth the house once held had burned out long ago, or maybe it had never really been there to begin with. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and kept walking, guided not by anger, but by something far more dangerous to the ones who had dismissed him: conviction. Back inside, Richard resumed talking, this time about Noah's science fair project. Emily rolled her eyes but played along. Susan looked down at Ethan's empty chair, then at his full plate, and for just a second, her fork hovered in the air. No one called him. No one got up to check where he'd gone. After all, why would they? In their eyes, he had nothing to offer, nothing worth chasing. But for the first time in his 19 years, Ethan wasn't waiting to be noticed. He had quietly walked away from the only people who had ever made him feel invisible. And this time, he wasn't coming back for their approval. He was going to make sure they'd have to hear about him from someone else. And when they did, it wouldn't be around a dinner table. It would be on a screen, a headline, a whisper in a boardroom, far beyond the walls of a house that once called him useless. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. But the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. And no one at that table would forget it. The first few hours passed without alarm. Ethan often kept to himself, disappearing into his room for entire weekends with his headphones on or staying out late sketching ideas at the park or library. So when evening turned to night and his seat at the dinner table remained vacant, no one said much. Richard assumed it was just another one of Ethan's quiet tantrums. Susan washed the dishes in silence. Emily scrolled through her phone, and Noah finished his homework. The house went to sleep without Ethan. By midnight, Susan sent a casual text. "Where are you?" No reply. By 1 o'clock in the morning, her tone changed. "Ethan, answer me." At 2:30, she called his phone. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. When she woke up at 7 o'clock the next morning, her phone was littered with failed calls. That's when a concern truly began to creep in. Not panic, not yet, but that gnawing feeling only a mother knows when something isn't quite right. She went to Ethan's room, knocked once, then pushed the door open. Empty. Everything looked undisturbed. The bed neatly made. Desk cluttered with small mechanical parts and notebooks. A few clothes on the back of the chair. His backpack was missing. So was his laptop. That part struck her like a pin to the chest. She hurried downstairs, her footsteps sharp on the wooden steps. Richard was already at the kitchen counter, drinking coffee and scanning the news on his tablet. "Ethan didn't come home," Susan said quickly. Richard didn't even look up. "He's sulking. He'll come crawling back when he gets hungry." "No, Richard. He's gone," she insisted, her voice tense now. "His bag is missing. His laptop's not there. He didn't sleep in his room." Richard sighed, still not taking her seriously. "He's playing a game, Susan. That boy's dramatic." She stood in front of him now. "I've called him 12 times. He's not answering. Not even a text. That's not like him." Richard finally looked up, his expression hard but now slightly disturbed. He reached for his phone. "Fine. I'll try." One call. No answer. Another. Nothing. They waited, standing silently in the kitchen, the coffee growing cold, the light outside growing stronger. Susan called Emily, who was already halfway to her part-time job. "Did Ethan say anything to you last night?" Emily groaned. "No, he just left. Honestly, I thought he'd be back before dessert." "Why?" "He never came home." Emily hesitated. "He probably just wants attention. He'll show up." Susan didn't respond. She hung up. At 9 o'clock, Richard called the school. Ethan wasn't scheduled for any classes. He had dropped out his community college courses 2 months ago, something Richard had reluctantly accepted after a shouting match no one liked to mention. So there was no professor to call, no campus to check. He wasn't working. He didn't drive. And no one, it seemed, had seen him. By noon, Susan began calling Ethan's old friends. Most said they hadn't spoken to him in weeks. One admitted they didn't even know if Ethan still lived at home. That realization hit her harder than she expected, that her son had drifted so far from everyone, even his own peers, that no one knew anything about his life anymore. The hours stretched. By mid-afternoon, she sat on the living room couch with her phone clenched in her hand, scrolling through Ethan's social media. Nothing. No new posts. No stories. No tweets. No check-ins. It was like he had vanished. Around 3 o'clock, Richard finally showed signs of discomfort. He paced in the backyard, muttering under his breath, occasionally glancing at the street like he expected Ethan to come around the corner on foot. Noah, curious but unbothered, asked, Is Ethan in trouble? Richard snapped. He'll be in trouble when he gets back, that's for sure. But Susan didn't echo the sentiment. She was now staring at a message she had sent that morning, unread, a small delivered underneath it, but no reply. She tried again. Please, just tell me you're safe. Still nothing. By evening, the mood in the house had shifted completely. What began as irritation and dismissal now hung heavy with something closer to fear. Susan sat at the kitchen table, her fingers locked together, eyes red. Emily came home, glanced at the scene, and froze. "What's going on?" she asked. "He's still not back," Susan said without lifting her head. Emily put down her bag slowly. "Did you call the police?" Richard responded before Susan could. "And say what?" "That a 19-year-old walked out of the house on his own." Emily didn't argue, but she didn't look satisfied either. She went to Ethan's room without asking and came back 10 minutes later, pale. His notebooks are gone. That detail meant something to her. She remembered how obsessed he had been with those messy little journals. Pages full of diagrams, calculations, inventions, and ideas too ambitious to share out loud. He carried them everywhere, like sacred artifacts. If they were gone, he wasn't just out, he had a plan. It was past 9 o'clock that night when Susan's phone buzzed again. Her heart leapt, but it wasn't a call from Ethan. It was her own call log. She scrolled, breath caught her throat, and realized the total. 42 missed calls to Ethan. And then, finally, a single message arrived. Not from Ethan, from Richard. He had sent it only a minute ago. One word, "Please." Susan turned to look at him. He was still standing by the window, arms crossed tightly, staring out into the street like he could will Ethan back into existence. She didn't say anything. They both knew what the word meant. It wasn't addressed to her. It was for their son. Neither of them admitted it. But a slow realization had begun to bloom between them, that maybe this wasn't just a phase. Maybe he wasn't just sulking. Maybe Ethan had made a decision. And maybe that decision included not coming back. At 10 o'clock that night, Susan tried one last time. She typed a message slowly, carefully, then deleted it. Instead, she left the phone unlocked beside her on the couch, the screen dim but waiting like a door left open. But Ethan didn't walk through it. He didn't respond that night. And the silence, once something they had weaponized against him, now turned against them. It crept into every room, every hour, every look they exchanged. It said what Ethan never did. It said, "I'm gone. And this time, I won't be the one looking back." Somewhere beyond the quiet suburbs of his childhood, Ethan stood inside an abandoned warehouse that smelled of metal, dust, and distant memories. The place had once been a delivery center for a chain supermarket, now long shut down and forgotten by the city. But to Ethan, it was a sanctuary, cold, empty, and quiet, just like the spaces he had learned to exist within for years. Here, he wasn't invisible. He was simply alone. And for the first time, that felt like an advantage. The building's back entrance still had a rusted keypad that Ethan had figured out weeks ago. Inside, he had cleaned out a corner of the storage space, laid down a sleeping bag, brought a portable heater, a solar panel rig he'd salvaged, and a few essentials. But more importantly, he had brought the real reason he had vanished. A suitcase filled with components, wires, circuit boards, and 3 notebooks filled with diagrams that had consumed his mind for the last 14 months. He sat cross-legged on the floor, hunched over a small workbench cobbled together from crates and plywood. Wires dangled from the ceiling, his laptop screen glowed faintly with lines of code, and the prototype lay in the center of the table. A sleek, palm-sized device shaped like a flat pebble, with a translucent shell and a blinking blue light at its core. It didn't look like much yet, not to someone who didn't know. But to Ethan, it was everything. The idea had come to him the previous winter during a blackout, while the family argued about the power bill and how long it would take the electric company to fix the outage. Ethan had sat in the dark, staring at the flickering light of a candle and thinking, there has to be a better way. That night, the blueprint began to form in his head, a device that could optimize household energy usage in real time, learning habits, redirecting loads, detecting inefficiencies, and minimizing waste without the user needing to understand the underlying tech. It wasn't just a smart monitor. It was a guide, a manager, and in some cases, a protector against financial drain. Of course, no one in his house had asked what he was working on. No one had noticed the late nights, the deliveries of tiny parts, the scribbled calculations stuck to his wall, or the burn mark on his hand from a failed soldering attempt. They didn't ask why he spent hours in the garage with the door closed, or why he had stopped trying to share his progress at the dinner table. Not once had anyone looked at what he was building. They only noticed his silence. But Ethan had always seen that as part of the process. Innovation didn't require applause. It required obsession. And he had plenty of that. He glanced at the power cell indicator on his laptop. 47%. Enough to keep running the simulations until sunrise. He pushed his sleeves up, revealing faded ink marks on his wrist from notes he had scribbled in a rush the day before. He was close. The device now successfully read household energy spikes and responded in milliseconds, rerouting power in his mock circuits just like it would in a real home. The casing still needed refinement, and the interface wasn't user-friendly yet. But the core, the brain, it worked. It actually worked. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. For all the nights he had worked through exhaustion, all the moments of doubt, all the failed iterations, this was the moment that kept him going. Not the applause, not the approval, just the quiet, irrefutable truth that something he imagined had taken shape in the real world. He closed his laptop and took a long sip from a thermos of lukewarm coffee. Then he picked up one of his notebooks and flipped to a page near the back. It was filled with potential names for the device. Nothing felt right yet. He circled the word pulse and underlined it once. He turned to another page, a diagram of a potential app interface, sketched in pencil and annotated with margins full of calculations. Below it, in smaller writing, were notes about which local investors had rejected him and why. One said he lacked market knowledge. Another said he was too young. The third never responded. It didn't matter anymore. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to finish what he started. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, his phone buzzed again. He didn't check it. He had silenced all notifications days ago, but he could still see the number flashing on the cracked screen. It was his mother. Again, he stared at the phone without emotion, then turned it face down. The truth was, Ethan wasn't running from home. He was running towards something bigger than home. For months, he had been preparing. He had quietly applied to innovation grants, submitted abstracts on online forums, and posted anonymous updates on engineering message boards. A week ago, one of his posts had caught traction. A small clip of the device in action, uploaded without his name, had received over 30,000 views in 3 days. A few engineers had reached out. One of them was a name he recognized, someone who had worked on early smart thermostat models. Another was a college professor from out of state who wanted to see more. And just 2 days ago, he had received a message that changed everything. Are you available to demonstrate the prototype in person? We might be able to help with funding. The meeting was in 48 hours. That was why he couldn't go back. Not yet. Not even for his mother's voice, or the panic he imagined in her texts. He wasn't cruel, but he understood something now that he hadn't before. Sometimes, the only way to become someone new is to disappear from a version of yourself that everyone thinks they know. He returned to the table, adjusted the micro camera positioned above the device, and began recording a new demonstration. This time, he spoke directly to the lens. His voice was clear, calm, and without hesitation. My name is Ethan Powell. I'm 19 years old. I developed a prototype designed to reduce household energy waste by as much as 30% in high-consumption areas. It learns user behavior, identifies inefficiencies, and reroutes energy in real time. It's fully functional, and I built it alone. He paused for a moment, looking directly into the camera. I didn't do this for a grade. I didn't do it for attention. I did it because I know what it's like to live in a house where you're always one bill away from fear. And I believe we can do better. He ended the recording and uploaded it privately to the contact who had requested it. Then he sat back, watching the upload bar crawl forward, slowly, steadily, like everything else he had done. He thought of his father's words again, not the volume of them, but the weight. You're the most useless son in this house. The sentence no longer stung. It had lost its power. Because Ethan had found something stronger than validation. He had found purpose. And that was something no one could give him or take away. By early morning, Ethan had barely slept. A short nap in his sleeping bag gave his mind just enough rest to stay sharp, but the exhaustion lingered like smoke in his chest. The prototype sat completed, cool to the touch, quietly blinking on the makeshift workstation. His hands trembled slightly as he packed it into a foam-lined box he had custom-shaped out of recycled packaging. Every corner of this process was improvised, but precise. He didn't have the money or tools of a lab, but he had clarity, and that had kept the project alive this far. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. He had less than 24 hours to find a space where he could test the device in real-world conditions. The simulation was solid, but investors wanted results in environments they could recognize. A functioning kitchen, a living room, a house with a power circuit, lighting loads, and appliances running. And that was the first problem. He couldn't go home. The irony hit hard. The very place that had inspired the device, the very environment where it had been conceived, was now inaccessible. Returning to the house would not only raise questions, it would undermine the foundation he was trying to build. Ethan knew the moment he walked back in, he'd no longer be a creator. He'd be reduced again, reclassified into the family's hierarchy of roles. The silent one, the difficult one, the disappointment. He needed another location. Fast. He spent the rest of the morning sending messages through forums, reaching out to anyone in the city who had offered even a trace of support in the past. One person, a tech blogger who had liked his prototype video, replied quickly but said she was traveling. Another, a retired electrician who commented positively on a thread, didn't respond. By noon, he had burned through most of his portable data. His phone was on 20% battery. The solar panel he used to charge his devices needed direct sunlight, and the sky outside had gone gray. He stared at the prototype, heart heavy. This was the wall. The first real one. Not emotional, not psychological. A logistical wall. A real brick-and-circuit kind of problem that couldn't be solved by effort alone. He stepped outside the warehouse, breathing the crisp air, his mind running through alternatives. He considered breaking into an abandoned house nearby, but the thought made his chest tighten. Not because he feared getting caught, but because it would ruin the legitimacy of what he was trying to prove. The presentation had to be clean, ethical, replicable. If he couldn't demonstrate the device in a real home, he might as well cancel the meeting. He walked 2 blocks to the edge of the neighborhood where industrial turned into residential. From the sidewalk, he watched houses with lit porches, dog barks in the distance, cars pulling in and out of driveways. None of them were options. He had no contacts, no safe entry point. Just a cold reminder that no matter how far his mind had gone, his body was still tethered to circumstances he hadn't yet escaped. The last option on his list was one he had avoided until now, Mrs. Callahan. She had been his computer science teacher in high school, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice who had once pulled Ethan aside after class to tell him, "You see things other students don't." He hadn't believed her then, but when he posted the video of the prototype, it was her message that arrived first. "Tell me where you are. I want to help." He hadn't answered, not because he didn't trust her, but because he wasn't ready for help. Now, he didn't have the luxury of pride. Ethan sat on the curb and typed, "Is offer still open?" "Within minutes," she replied. "Always. Come to the back entrance of the academy building. I'll leave the door open." He stood, stuffed the prototype case into his backpack, and began walking. The building was 20 blocks away. He didn't have money for a bus or rideshare, so he moved on foot, ducking into alleyways to avoid being seen. It took him just under an hour. When he arrived, the private academy's back gate was ajar. He slipped through and found the side entrance propped open with a small stone. The hallway was dim, empty. It smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies. Mrs. Callahan was waiting in her office. She stood when he entered, eyes soft but unreadable. Her short gray hair was pulled back, and she wore the same brown cardigan he remembered from school. "You look tired," she said. "I am. I'm glad you came." He nodded, unslinging his backpack and placing the case gently on her desk. They sat in silence for a moment, and then she asked, "May I see it?" Ethan opened a case slowly. The device looked even smaller now, resting in its dark lining. Mrs. Callahan leaned forward, her hands resting on the desk, eyes scanning the details with the quiet intensity of someone who recognized what they were looking at. "You built this on your own?" He nodded. She reached toward it, but paused. "May I?" "Go ahead," he said. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "Have you tested in a real home?" "Not yet," he admitted. "That's why I'm here." She looked at him, then at the device. "I live in a small apartment above the library wing. It's connected to the building's old electrical system. Not a perfect house, but it's a start." Ethan's relief was immediate. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased. They walked together to the apartment. The stairs creaked under their feet, and the narrow hallway smelled faintly of old books. Her living room was modest. 2 armchairs, a small couch, shelves full of tech manuals and literature. She pointed to the corner where the main fuse box sat and said, "Will this work?" "It's perfect." The setup took 2 hours. Ethan worked with methodical speed, explaining only when asked. Mrs. Callahan watched him, occasionally handing him tools, sometimes just observing. When everything was connected, Ethan powered the device and monitored the interface from his laptop. The first data streams appeared within minutes, detecting appliances, measuring current draw, establishing behavioral patterns. "This is incredible," she murmured, watching the graphs shift in real time. Ethan didn't respond. He was too focused, fingers flying across the keyboard, correcting small irregularities. He adjusted the sensor range, recalibrated the heat maps, and by the 3rd hour, the device had begun to suggest energy-saving actions based on her routine. He stepped back. "It's ready. You'll present this tomorrow?" "Yes." Mrs. Callahan nodded, then said gently, "They're going to ask about your background, your credentials, where you come from." "I know." "And what will you tell them?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, the sun setting behind the trees. Then he turned back to her and said, "I'll tell them I came from a place that didn't see me, and that I built something that can help people who live in places like that." She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. "You're going to change things," she said. "Maybe," he replied. "But first I need them to listen." And this time, they would. Ethan arrived at the presentation site nearly 2 hours early, his prototype secured tightly in a reinforced backpack, and a printed folder containing supporting documentation clutched in his hand. The building was a sleek, modern structure tucked in the heart of the city's innovation district, its glass facade reflecting the morning light in sharp, pristine angles. Every step he took toward the entrance felt like a test of resolve. He had never been in a place like this before, not just physically, but symbolically. This wasn't just about showing what he had built. This was about proving he deserved to be in the room. The lobby was quiet when he entered, save for the soft tapping of a receptionist's fingers on a keyboard. She glanced up and gave a polite nod before gesturing toward a seating area. Ethan sat, kept his eyes forward, and tried to keep his breathing steady. He didn't check his phone. He had already silenced it the night before. Whatever messages were waiting could wait a little longer. This moment needed his full attention. 30 minutes later, a man with close-cropped hair and a blazer over a t-shirt emerged from a hallway. He looked around the lobby and called out, "Ethan Powell?" Ethan stood. "Hi," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Michael. I run the Innovation Fund here. We got a space set up for your demo." Ethan followed him through a corridor lined with framed photos of past grant winners and their inventions. Michael spoke casually as they walked, asking brief, pointed questions. "So, you built a real-time energy optimization device?" "Yes." "Solo?" "Yes." "How old are you again?" 19. Michael smiled, but didn't say anything. At the end of the hallway, he pushed open a glass door that led to a small conference room. A table, a large screen, and 4 chairs. There were already 2 people seated, a woman in a charcoal suit with a tablet on her lap, and an older man in a checkered shirt leaning back in his chair with folded arms. They both turned to look at Ethan as he entered. "This is him?" the woman asked. Michael nodded. "Ethan Powell. Go ahead and set up." Ethan didn't waste time. He pulled the prototype from his pack, uncoiled the cords, and began assembling the test station on the table. The room was quiet except for the soft clicks of his setup. When the device blinked to life, its faint blue light filled the center of the table, drawing all eyes to it. The older man leaned forward. "That's it." Ethan nodded. "This is the core unit. The software runs in the cloud, but the real-time adjustments happen through this hardware." The woman tapped something on her tablet. "Show us." Ethan launched the companion dashboard on the screen. He spoke clearly now, more confident than even he expected, walking them through the system's architecture, data processing, and behavioral adaptation. The graphs began to shift as the test appliances, connected through relays, kicked into simulated usage. It took 10 minutes for the tension in the room to change. By the time he demonstrated the device responding to a sudden power surge by instantly redistributing energy flow, the woman in the suit had leaned forward, her fingers stilling over the tablet. Michael broke the silence first. "You said you built this alone?" "Yes." "No university lab? No incubator?" "No," Ethan replied. "I used salvage parts. Built the casing from scratch. The algorithm took the longest. I had to simulate multiple occupancy profiles before I could learn adaptively." The older man asked, "Have you patented this?" "Filed provisionally last week." "And the manufacturing plan?" "I have 3 possible pathways. 2 are modular builds through local supply chains, and 1 uses repurposed materials for sustainability. I've outlined all 3 in the brief I provided." The woman closed her tablet and looked at Michael. "Have you read the forum thread on this?" He nodded. "That's how I found him. Anonymous upload with full transparency. The feedback's been overwhelmingly positive." She turned to Ethan. "What are you looking for? Investment? Partnership?" Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. "Both. I need infrastructure, a lab, access to real homes to conduct longitudinal tests. And I need someone who believes this matters." The older man, who had said the least, finally smiled. "You've got something real here, Ethan." Michael nodded slowly. "And timing is everything. The market's primed for energy efficiency." But more than that, he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your project has story, purpose. People respond to that." The woman stood. "I'll make a few calls. We have an opening in our residential pilot program. If you can get this device field tested with actual families, we'll push it towards scaling." Ethan felt his pulse spike. Michael handed him a card. "Meet us here tomorrow morning. We'll introduce you to the implementation team." The room emptied as quickly as it had filled. Ethan was left standing next to the still glowing prototype, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. It hadn't been just a meeting. It was a turning point. He packed up in silence and stepped back into the city sunlight. The cold was still there, but it felt different now. Bracing, not punishing. As he walked down the sidewalk, his phone buzzed. This time he looked. 47 missed calls. 14 messages from his mom. 2 from his sister. And at the bottom, 1 from his father. No subject, just a single word. "Please." Ethan stared at it for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The word no longer held power. It didn't carry the same weight it had when he was sitting at the dinner table, trying to speak only to be silenced. Now he had a different audience, one that listened. He didn't reply. Instead, he walked toward the nearest train station, pulled out the envelope Michael had handed him, and read it again. The address of a residential test site, the name of a project coordinator, and a time. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. He had less than 24 hours to prepare. And this time, he wasn't walking into a house where he didn't belong. He was walking into one that needed exactly what he had built. At first, Richard Powell barely noticed the stillness that had settled in the house. It was subtle, like the quiet that lingers after a storm. Not immediately alarming, but unnervingly consistent. Ethan's absence had stretched from hours to days, and now it had been nearly a week since the night he walked out without looking back. Richard hadn't mentioned it aloud since the first morning, brushing off Susan's concern with a grunt and a dismissive wave of his hand. But the silence had begun to find its way into him, threading itself into the corners of his mind in places he didn't expect. It was Wednesday evening. Richard sat in his leather armchair in the living room, a sports channel droning in the background, volume low. He wasn't really watching. His eyes flicked occasionally toward the hallway, toward the closed door of Ethan's bedroom. He hadn't opened it, not since the morning after Ethan left. He told himself he didn't care, told himself the boy would come crawling back, full of apologies and excuses. But now, even the certainty in that fantasy had begun to erode. Across the room, Susan quietly folded laundry, her movements methodical and precise. She hadn't mentioned Ethan again either, not directly, but her eyes lingered longer on the front window. Her phone never left her side, and every time she sighed, there was a weight behind it that Richard had never heard before. Emily came in from work just after 7 o'clock. She dropped her bag on the floor, slipped off her shoes, and walked past them both without a word. She paused at the stairs, glanced at Ethan's door, then kept walking. No sarcastic comments. No mocking jabs. Just silence. Richard finally turned off the television. "He'll be back," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Susan didn't answer. She continued folding a sweatshirt, Ethan's. She held it for a moment longer than the others before placing it in a neat pile. "You don't know that," she said. Richard looked at her, annoyed. He's not stupid. He knows he can't survive on his own. Susan turned her head slowly. "I think you underestimate him." Richard scoffed. "Don't romanticize it, Susan." He walked out because he didn't like being told the truth. She met his eyes now, not blinking. "No." He walked out because you never care to hear his truth. The words landed harder than she intended. Richard shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Don't start." But she didn't back down. You never asked him what he was working on. Never gave him the time of day. You cut him off before he could finish a sentence. He was wasting time, Richard snapped, tinkering in that garage like it meant something. He should have been in school. He should have had a plan. "And maybe he did," Susan said, "but you never let him show it." The silence returned, deeper now, thicker. Later that night, Richard found himself pacing the upstairs hallway. He stopped in front of Ethan's room. The door was still shut. He reached for the handle, hesitated, then slowly opened it. The room smelled faintly of solder and dust. Everything was just as Ethan had left it. The bed was made. The desk was cluttered with empty sockets, stray wires, and diagrams that looked more like puzzles than blueprints. Richard stepped inside, feeling like an intruder. He picked up one of the notebooks, flipped through it, saw words and symbols he didn't understand. Adaptive load management, one page said. Another read. Problem: existing systems reactive, not predictive. Solution: machine learning behavior mapping. He stared at it for a long time. This wasn't a child's hobby. It wasn't a distraction of someone lazy or lost. It was something else entirely. Something focused, sharp. He put the notebook down and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't know what to think. For the first time in years, Richard felt unsure, not of the world, but of himself. The next day, he left for work early but found himself distracted. In meetings, his mind drifted. On calls, he found himself irritated, impatient. At lunch, he sat alone in his office and checked Ethan's social media, only to find that his son hadn't posted anything in months. That evening, he sat with Noah at the dinner table while Susan served them. Emily wasn't home yet. The house felt emptier than usual. Out of nowhere, Noah asked, "Is Ethan okay?" Richard looked up. Of course he is. Why wouldn't he be? He'd been gone a long time. Richard didn't know how to answer. Instead, he focused on his plate. "I miss him," Noah said. Susan glanced at Richard, but said nothing. After dinner, Richard stood in the garage for nearly 20 minutes. He didn't touch anything, just stared at the wall where Ethan had mounted a whiteboard, now wiped clean except for the ghost of some erased equations. There were smudges on the floor where Ethan had once sat cross-legged for hours, sketching and building. Richard leaned against the doorframe and ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to admit it, but something about the boy's disappearance had unsettled him. Not just the absence, but the lack of noise. Ethan hadn't stormed out. He hadn't screamed. He had simply left. Quietly, decisively, as if he had known exactly what he was doing. That night, Richard sat at his study and opened his laptop. He searched Ethan's name, then variations of it. Nothing. Then he remembered the notebook, the device Ethan had mentioned. He typed in keywords: real-time energy optimizer, adaptive load device, teen energy invention. After scrolling for nearly an hour, he found a forum post. No name, just a short video demonstration, a palm-sized device, a dashboard displaying live data, and a voice, calm, clear, unmistakably Ethan's, explaining how it worked. Richard sat frozen. At the bottom of the thread were dozens of comments. Engineers praising the algorithm, developers asking about integration. One wrote, "Whoever built this, they're ahead of the curve. This could change the way we manage home energy." He played the video again. This time he listened. It was past midnight when he finally closed the laptop. The house was dark. Susan was asleep. Richard stood in the hallway, staring at Ethan's door once more. He pulled out his phone, opened the last message he had sent. "Please." No reply. He typed a new one, then deleted it. He tried again. Finally, he sent, "I saw what you built." No answer. He stayed awake another hour, just in case. But the screen remained blank. And for the first time, Richard Powell, father, provider, unquestioned head of the household, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Irrelevant. Ethan arrived at the testing site just before 9:30 in the morning. The building sat on a quiet street in a modest neighborhood on the city's west side. Nothing like the steel and glass high-rises of the Innovation District. This was a small brick structure attached to a single-story duplex, flanked by chain-link fences and narrow driveways. It looked ordinary, worn, lived in, which made it perfect. Inside, he was greeted by Claire, the project coordinator assigned to oversee his pilot phase. She was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and dressed casually in jeans and a navy blue sweater. She offered a brisk but sincere handshake and gestured toward a layout diagram taped to the wall. "We're using this unit here," she said, pointing to the right side of the duplex. 3 occupants. Older house. Outdated electrical system. High energy bills, according to their last 6 months of statements. "Perfect," Ethan replied. Claire raised an eyebrow. "You sure? The wiring in there is a mess. We had to shut down a section of the panel just last week. It's not exactly a clean install. That's exactly why I need it." She smiled at that. "Fair enough. Let's get you in." The interior of the unit told a familiar story. Yellow paint on the walls, flickering kitchen light, an old refrigerator that hummed louder than necessary. The residents, a middle-aged couple and their teenage daughter, welcomed Ethan politely, though cautiously. They had been told this was part of an energy savings initiative, and while they didn't fully understand the tech, the promise of lower bills had been enough to win their cooperation. Ethan worked quietly, methodically. The entire setup took close to 3 hours. He installed the prototype on a central junction hub, connected sensors to key appliances, and integrated the interface through a secure local connection. Claire observed, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly letting him work. By early afternoon, everything was live. On the screen of his laptop, the dashboard flickered to life with raw data, voltage fluctuations, peak usage patterns, baseline loads. The software adjusted within minutes, learning the habits of the household in real time. By 4 o'clock, the device had already optimized the heating system to run more efficiently and identified 2 appliances causing unnecessary power drains. "This is fast," Claire said, watching the data adjust. "Faster than anything we've tested before." Ethan nodded but stayed focused. "It'll get more accurate overnight. The system adapts faster once it gets a full cycle." They left the unit just before sunset. Outside, Claire paused, then turned to him. "You want to know what I think?" Ethan met her eyes, waiting. "You're not just solving a technical problem. You're offering control to people who've never had it. People who live paycheck to paycheck and can't afford to think about energy efficiency because they're just trying to keep the lights on." Ethan didn't respond right away. He looked back at the house, the soft glow of light spilling from the windows. "That's why I built it," he said finally. Claire nodded. "I'm going to write up today's report and send it to the board. You'll hear from us tomorrow. But off the record, she smiled faintly. I think this is going to be big. That night, Ethan returned to the warehouse. The silence there had always been a comfort, but tonight it felt different. Not empty, just quiet, purposeful, like a breath held at the edge of something new. He opened his laptop, ran diagnostics on the day's data, and prepared a summary for the review team. For the first time in weeks, his hands didn't tremble when he typed. Every line he wrote felt like it belonged. Sometime after midnight, he lay back on his makeshift bed and stared at the ceiling. His mind didn't race with doubt or calculations. It rested. He slept without dreams. The next morning, a message arrived at 7:42. Subject: preliminary approval, pilot phase. Content: the board is impressed. Your device is being fast-tracked to the second phase of testing. We'll be assigning you a university back lab for continued development. Details to follow. He stared at the email for a long moment, not because he couldn't believe it, but because he could. He had imagined this exact message, prepared for it, built toward it, and now it was real. By 9 o'clock, he was walking into the lab. The space was unlike anything he'd ever worked in. Wide benches, high ceilings, natural light, and rows of organized tools and components. A staff technician greeted him and showed him where he could set up. He placed a prototype gently on a steel table, connected it to a larger testing rig, and opened his notebook to begin the next iteration. He didn't take a photo, didn't post about it, didn't text anyone. He just got to work. Later that afternoon, a small group of university researchers came in to observe. They asked questions, offered feedback, and, unlike what he had experienced before, listened without condescension. One of them, a professor of applied engineering, even pulled him aside. I've read the white paper you submitted. If you're open to it, I'd like to co-author a technical paper with you. It could help open doors for funding. Ethan didn't hesitate. I'm in. He stayed late into the night, making adjustments, preparing for the next set of tests. Claire didn't react immediately. She just nodded once. First time since I left. What did he say? Ethan showed her the message. She read it in silence, then handed the phone back. That's big. Yeah. What are you thinking? I don't know if I can go back. Because of him? Because of who I was when I lived there. Claire crossed her arms. You know, people think coming back means retreating. Like it undoes everything you've done. But it doesn't. Not if you walk in as who you are now. Ethan considered that. I don't know if I'm ready to see him. You don't have to be ready. You just have to know why you'd go. I'm not sure I do. She nodded again. Then maybe wait until you do. They returned to work, but Ethan's concentration wavered. His eyes drifted off into his phone, now face down again beside his laptop. The humming machines no longer drowned out the question in his head. Not should I go, but do I need to? That night, he left the lab later than usual. The city streets were quiet, pockets of orange light stretching along the sidewalks. He walked without a destination, hands in his jacket, head low. He passed a convenience store where he used to buy soldering wire and cheap snacks during his early prototyping days. He paused, looked through the window, and remembered the night he stood there with $20 to his name and a half-finished circuit in his bag. That version of himself had dreamed of today, of credibility, of validation. Now, he had it, but it came with echoes. Back at the warehouse, he powered down the lights and lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the rafters above. The message replayed in his mind over and over again. I'm sorry for everything. Please come home. He didn't respond that night, not because he was angry, but because he understood something now. His father's message was not an invitation. It was an opening, and Ethan had learned something in the past few weeks. He no longer needed permission to be who he was. He would answer, but not tonight, not until he could do it on his own terms. The second wave of field testing began on a cold Thursday morning. Ethan arrived early to University Lab, bundled in layers, breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. The city felt sharper in the mornings now, as if the air itself was aware that something significant was underway. Inside the lab, the atmosphere was different, not just busy, but urgent. Engineers moved between workstations, reviewing data from a new test homes, syncing devices, adjusting code. What had started as one boy with a soldering iron and an idea had grown into a fully coordinated team, working under his direction. But even as the project expanded, Ethan kept his focus narrow. Each change in voltage, each behavioral pattern detected by the system, each household's feedback was carefully cataloged and analyzed. He wasn't chasing recognition. He was chasing refinement, precision, effectiveness. By noon, he was preparing for a meeting with potential investor, a private fund manager who had taken an interest after reading the early reports on Ethan's pilot. Claire had warned him this one was different, not just another bureaucrat or cautious financier. This was someone who had personally built and backed multiple energy startups, someone who could understand what Ethan was doing not just in theory, but in function. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock in a private boardroom at a co-working tech hub downtown. Claire met him outside the building, her coat buttoned against the wind. "You ready?" she asked. Ethan gave a quick nod, the prototype box under his arm. Inside, the space was modern and warm, minimalist design, glass walls, soft lighting. They were directed to a second-floor room with a long table, a wall-mounted screen, and a small coffee cart in the corner. A man stood by the window, back turned to them, looking out over the city. When he turned, Ethan was struck by how unassuming he looked. Maybe in his early 40s, slim, dressed in a gray sweater and jeans, no flash, no entourage. He smiled and extended a hand. "You're Ethan. I'm Nathan Mercer." Ethan shook his hand, noting the strength in the grip, the directness of the gaze. Nathan wasn't someone who traded in vague optimism. He had the look of a man who only invested in what he believed in. They sat. Claire remained in the room, but let Ethan take the lead. Nathan got right to it. "I've been following your project since the first thread on the engineering forum. At the time, I didn't know who you were. Then I watched your demo video. Impressive. And when I saw your pilot results last week, I asked for this meeting." Ethan nodded once, quietly grateful for the directness. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "Before we get into the numbers and models, I want to ask you something." "Sure," Ethan said. "Why did you build this?" The question caught him off guard, though he knew it shouldn't have. The walls of the lab began to fill with new sketches, updated graphs, and printouts of data trends. Everything moved forward with momentum, not chaos, but flow, purpose. That weekend, he received another email, this time from a journalist covering emerging technologies. The reporter had stumbled upon the forum video and was requesting an interview. Ethan declined politely, asking for time. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet, but the message confirmed something he already suspected. The outside world was watching. In the quiet of the lab, surrounded by the steady hum of machines and the scribbles of progress, Ethan paused only once, to look at the prototype resting in its cradle. It didn't look different, but everything around it had changed. And so had he. The air in the lab was still when Ethan arrived early Monday morning. A layer of morning fog clung to the windows, and the hallway lights buzzed faintly as he keyed in the door code. Inside, the space was just as he left it, pristine, focused, and humming with quiet potential. His workstation was already prepped from a night before, the prototype calibrated, the updated code ready for deployment, and a second unit, sleek, thinner, more refined, charging on the steel work table beneath the primary test console. It was launch week. Claire had sent word that the second round of field testing was greenlit across 5 new households, and the university team had cleared the final compliance hurdle for the live grid integration test. What had once been a desperate sketch in a basement had now become a fully funded, institutionally supported pilot program. Ethan was not just a participant. He was at the center of it. He had barely slept over the weekend. The weight of momentum was exhilarating, almost addictive. Every hour brought new progress. Refinement to the learning model, better interface feedback, more efficient data compression. He was building not just a device, but an ecosystem, an intelligent, adaptable solution to one of the most common, overlooked burdens in low and middle-income households. By 11 in the morning, He was reviewing feedback from the original test household. The device had reduced energy usage by 17% in the first 72 hours. That number was not just statistically significant. It was transformative. It meant real savings, real impact, something he could scale, something that mattered. He leaned back, stretched his arms over his head, and for the first time that day, picked up his phone. There were the usual notifications, emails, system alerts, calendar reminders, but at the top of the screen sat a missed call. The number was familiar. His father. No message. Below it, a second missed call, same number, and then a text, "I'm sorry for everything. Please come home." Ethan stared at the screen, unmoving. The words were simple, but they struck with a kind of violence that data and deadlines couldn't shield him from. He placed the phone down on the table, slowly, carefully, as if it had become something volatile. He sat in silence, unsure what to feel. It wasn't the first time he'd imagined a moment like this. In his head, he had constructed dozens of versions. Sometimes his father apologized in anger, sometimes with pride, sometimes through gritted teeth, barely able to admit he'd been wrong. But none of them matched this. There was no defense, no explanation, just those 6 words. "Please come home." He stood and began to pace the room. The lab felt suddenly too small, like the walls had moved a few inches. His mind, once razor-focused on circuits and code, now clouded with memories of that dinner table. The cold finality of his father's voice, the smile that wasn't a smile when he left. Part of him wanted to go, to walk to the front door, unannounced, and see if anything had really changed. Maybe his room was still untouched. Maybe his mother would be in the kitchen, and Noah would be on the couch with his video games. Maybe Emily would roll her eyes the way she always had. And maybe his father would be sitting in his usual chair, not with pride, but with recognition. But another part of him, the stronger part, knew that going back meant something more than reconciliation. It meant risk, because it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about identity. He wasn't the same person who had walked out that night. He had changed, grown, built something that the world now took seriously. To return, even with a soft heart, could fracture that new foundation. He stared at the prototype, still humming gently on the workbench. It had no emotion, no history, just purpose, just clarity. The door opened, and Claire stepped in, holding 2 paper coffee cups. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the tension in his stance. "Yeah," he said too quickly. Then, softer, "I don't know." She set the coffee down and leaned against the counter. "Something wrong with the data?" "No. Not that." He hesitated, then said, "My dad called." He looked at the prototype on the table, then back at Nathan. "Because I grew up in a house where energy bills were a constant stress. We were always close to the edge. And it wasn't that we were irresponsible. We just didn't have control. I wanted to give people like my family that control. I wanted to give them a tool that learns their habits and helps them save, without requiring them to be engineers or energy experts." Nathan studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Good answer. Now show me." Ethan launched the interface, connecting his laptop to the prototype. He ran through a live simulation of a typical household load, adjusting for peak usage, demonstrating the device's ability to redirect energy demand in real time. He showed the app interface, the learning model graphs, and the long-term efficiency projections. Nathan didn't interrupt once. He watched, asked specific questions about latency and firmware flexibility, and took notes by hand. When Ethan finished, Nathan sat in silence for several seconds. Then he said, "You know, I've seen a lot of pitches, a lot of ideas, some good, some not, but I've rarely seen something that's developed coming from someone your age." Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a test. Nathan continued, "Most people your age are trying to go viral. You're trying to build something that actually matters. That says something." Ethan finally spoke. "I'm not trying to prove anyone wrong. I'm just trying to do something right." Nathan chuckled. "That might be the best pitch I've ever heard." He paused, then leaned forward. "Let me tell you something," he said. "You're not useless. You were just surrounded by the wrong people. The sentence hit harder than Ethan expected. It didn't sting. It echoed, as if someone had finally said out loud what he had always known, but never dared to articulate. He didn't look at Claire. He didn't need to. He just nodded once. Nathan slid a folder across the table. I want in. I'm prepared to invest. But I don't just want to be a silent partner. I want to help you scale this. Connect you to the right manufacturers. Bring in policy advisors. This could be national within 18 months. Ethan stared at the folder. His name was on the cover. Inside was a draft agreement. Not a vague offer, not a verbal promise. A real proposal. Signed. Claire looked at him. You don't have to decide right now, she said gently. But Ethan already knew. I'm in, he said. Nathan smiled. Good. Then let's change the industry together. They shook hands again. As Ethan left the building that afternoon, the wind had picked up. He pulled his jacket tight and walked a few blocks before stopping at a small cafe and sitting outside with a coffee, letting the moment settle in his bones. He had done it. No one had given him permission. No one had opened the door for him. He had built the key. And now, not only was the world watching, it was following. The contract was finalized by the following Monday. Ethan met with Nathan Mercer and a team of legal advisors at the firm's downtown office, a sleek 20th floor space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and muted conversation. After a thorough review of the terms and an hour of quiet deliberation, Ethan signed. The ink felt heavier than expected. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a commitment to a future that hadn't existed for him a month ago. The deal granted him access to a full-scale manufacturing network in California, with an initial round of 1,000 units to be produced for controlled release. Alongside the logistics and funding came office space in Palo Alto, a small but fully equipped lab, and a furnished studio apartment 5 minutes from a workspace. Everything was arranged, ready, and waiting for him. But there was a condition. He had to move within 1 week. Nathan didn't frame it as an ultimatum, more like a reality of the pace they were working at. The energy startup world didn't wait. Timing was everything, and if Ethan was going to lead the charge, he had to be where things happened. We need you there, not here. Nathan had said during the final call, you're not just a creator. You're the face of this now, and we're launching in less than 3 months. Ethan said he understood. He meant it. Still, when the call ended, he didn't immediately celebrate. Instead, he sat in silence in the corner of the warehouse, prototype in hand, staring at the blinking blue light that had come to define everything about the last year of his life. He would be leaving everything behind, not just the city, the lab, and the building that had become a sanctuary, but the very people who had built the walls that pushed him into this journey, the house he had grown up in, his mother, Noah, even Emily, whose silence lately had begun to weigh heavier than her old sarcasm ever did, and his father, the man who had reduced him to a single sentence at the dinner table, the man whose voice still echoed in the deepest part of his mind, even as he tried to silence it with progress and purpose. Now, on the edge of everything he'd worked for, Ethan faced something he hadn't prepared for. The weight of leaving permanently. He knew there was no turning back, not because of pride, not because of anger, but because he had finally created a world in which he didn't need to be defined by anyone else's expectations. Going home meant revisiting a version of himself he no longer recognized. That night, he visited the lab one last time. He moved through the workstation slowly, gathering his notebooks, packing the updated prototype, backing up all the code onto a secure drive. Claire met him there briefly to drop off the final package of travel documents and logistics. She said little, simply offered a quiet nod when she saw the way he lingered over every cable and connection. You'll be okay, she said softly. I know, and you're doing the right thing. I hope so. She paused. You haven't told them, have you? Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Claire didn't press further. She left him alone with his work. The following morning, with just 2 days left before the move, Ethan walked past his old neighborhood for the first time since he left. He didn't go all the way to the house, but he stood at the corner where the street curved, just close enough to see the outline of his family's porch through the trees. The windows were lit. Someone was home. He stood there for several minutes, his breath fogging the air, his fingers buried deep in his jacket pockets. He thought of knocking. He thought of Noah's face lighting up at the door, of Susan's worried eyes softening, of Emily, maybe surprised to see him, of Richard, silent, maybe standing behind him, unsure what to say. But instead, he turned and walked away. That night, he sent a single message to the family group chat, useless and busy. It was sharp, deliberate, a quiet retaliation. But more than anything, it was honest, a reflection of the person they had once dismissed, now too far ahead to be pulled back. He didn't expect a reply. Emily responded with a shocked emoji. His mother called within minutes. He didn't answer. Noah sent a voice message, just the sound of him saying, "Are you really leaving?" And Richard? Nothing. Not a word. Not a reaction. And maybe that hurt more than if he had raged. Ethan spent his last night in the warehouse staring at the rafters, bag packed, contract folder on the floor beside him. He played back the sounds of his journey. The clink of tools, the hum of circuits, the quiet voice of a teacher who believed in him before anyone else did. And, deeper still, the echo of that first silence, the one he left behind at the dinner table. He wasn't bitter. He was ready. At dawn, he boarded a flight to California. He didn't look back. The air in California was different. Sharper in the morning, drier in the afternoon, but always humming with the energy of motion. Ethan had barely been in Palo Alto for a week, yet every day felt like it stretched years beyond what he'd known before. His new apartment was small but clean, furnished with simplicity, just enough for function, nothing for comfort. He didn't need comfort. He had work. The lab, located inside a startup accelerator backed by Nathan Mercer's fund, was 5 blocks from his building. Ethan walked there every morning before sunrise, often arriving before the lights were on. The halls were filled with people who looked like they belonged. Engineers, programmers, designers, entrepreneurs, all moving quickly, all carrying something. For once, Ethan didn't feel like an outsider among them. He had his own key card, his own desk. His name was on the prototype batch schedule. A 3-person team had been assigned to him for support. A junior electrical engineer, a software integration specialist, and a production coordinator. They listened when he spoke, not because they had to, but because they respected what he had built. And for the first time, he wasn't just defending his idea. He was leading it. Each day blurred into the next, finalizing hardware components, testing the refined firmware, aligning the machine learning model with real user data from the pilot homes. Nathan dropped in occasionally, always brief but direct in his praise. "It's working, Ethan. And when we launch, people are going to remember your name." Despite the momentum, Ethan kept it himself. He didn't go out after hours, didn't socialize with the other teams. When invited to dinner or drinks, he politely declined, always with quiet smile. He wasn't avoiding connection. He was preserving focus. But even with all the noise of creation, something lingered in the quiet moments, a thread of thought he hadn't cut loose. It wasn't about the product. It wasn't about the team or the launch or the looming press interest. It was about the silence back home. On a Thursday night, nearly 2 weeks into his new life, he stood by the window of his apartment, looking out at the lights of the tech district below. His laptop was open on the kitchen table, screens filled with code, performance metrics, and internal memos. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He ignored the first vibration. The second one, he checked. Group chat. Family. His mother had messaged earlier that day. A photo of the dinner table. Noah's science project in the background. No caption, just the image. Ethan hadn't responded. Now, the thread showed a message from Emily. Not a joke, not sarcasm, just a line. "Dad's been quiet. I think he's been reading your articles." Ethan blinked. He hadn't realized any of them had followed the growing media around the prototype. A small blog had picked up the story of a self-taught teen engineer disrupting the energy space. Then a regional newspaper ran a profile. Nothing national yet, but enough. Below Emily's message, Susan had written, "He doesn't talk about it, but he printed one of the pages. I found it folded in his drawer." Ethan read the messages 3 times. Then, without overthinking, he opened the chat and typed, "Useless and busy." He stared at it, hit send. The reply came almost instantly. Emily again, a shocked emoji. Then a second message. "You're not serious." He didn't answer. His mother called seconds later. He watched the screen light up with her name. He didn't pick up. Not yet. Then Noah's name popped up, a voice message. Ethan played it. A brief pause, then his little brother's voice, soft and unsure. "Are you really never coming back?" The phone remained in his hand, heavier than before. Then the thread went quiet. No response from Richard. Not a word. Not a question. Not even a reaction. And in that absence, something shifted. Ethan hadn't needed closure. He had stopped needing permission a long time ago. But he had expected something. A fight. A plea. A comment. Even if it was anger, at least it would have meant that his father still held on to an image of him. Even a flawed one. But this? Silence. Ethan turned off the phone and walked back to his desk. He stared at the latest batch of testing results and reread a note from one of the senior engineers. The system passed the stress test at 100% load, ready for integration. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he sat in the dark, lit only by the glow of his monitor, and thought about the last time he had spoken to his father directly. Those 5 words, "You're the most useless son." He whispered them now under his breath. But the words didn't land the same. They weren't weapons anymore. They were fossils, reminders of a time he had outgrown, of a version of himself he no longer carried. Still, he wanted something from Richard. Not validation, not even regret, just recognition. Some fragment of acknowledgement that the boy who once sat silent at the dinner table had become someone worth listening to. That night, he opened a blank document on his laptop and began writing, not a letter, not a report, just words. His words. Everything he hadn't said. Not to be sent, not to be shared, just to be written. By the time the sun began to rise over the hills, the document was 6 pages long. It started with the sentence, "I left because I had to." It ended with, "I became someone you wouldn't recognize. And I'm not coming back to prove that. I'm staying away because I don't need it anymore." He saved the file, closed the laptop, and for the first time in a long time, the silence around him felt earned. The weeks that followed moved fast. Too fast, maybe. Ethan barely had time to process the shifting gravity of his life. The prototype had reached final approval. The first production line had launched in a manufacturing facility just outside Sacramento, and the press cycle had begun to intensify. What had once been a whisper of recognition had become something else entirely. Headlines, interviews, panels. His name began to circulate beyond the tech world, reaching financial blogs, lifestyle media, and even high school classrooms, where teachers used the story as a modern tale of resilience and innovation. Yet Ethan remained grounded, not because he was unaffected, but because part of him still operated from that original place. The warehouse corner, the hand-drawn circuit diagrams, the cold nights and unanswered questions. He still checked his phone less often than expected. He still preferred his lab to the networking dinners Nathan now insisted he attend. And he still hadn't responded to his family since the day he sent that cutting message, until the day his phone rang. It was noon. He was in the lab reviewing thermal test data on the 2nd-generation chip when the call came. A known number. He let it ring twice before instinct, or something deeper, made him answer. "Hello." There was a pause. Then his mother's voice, strained but clear. "Ethan?" He closed the laptop slowly. "Yeah, I'm here. I didn't think you'd pick up. I almost didn't." She exhaled, not a sigh of frustration. Something softer, like relief mixed with hesitation. "Your father's sick." The words hung in the air. Ethan didn't respond. "He's in the hospital," she continued. "They found something in his lung. We thought it was pneumonia, but it's more than that. They're running more tests." A long pause followed. Ethan could hear his own breathing now, louder than before. "I'm not calling to make you come back," Susan said gently. "I just thought you should know, in case." Her voice broke slightly, but she held it together. "I appreciate the call," Ethan said quietly. "He asked for you." That made him sit straighter. He did. He didn't say your name, but he asked if we had heard from you. That's more than he said in weeks. Ethan looked around the lab, the rows of tools and wires and monitors that had once made him feel so far from the world he came from. Now, they felt closer to it. I'm not sure if I should come. You don't have to decide now, she said. I just wanted to leave the door open. She gave him the name of the hospital, the room number, and a time when visiting hours were quiet. Then she hung up, leaving Ethan alone in the middle of something that didn't fit into any algorithm. He didn't go. Not that day. Not the next. He stayed in California. He worked. He tested. He met with a venture capital firm to discuss international expansion. He recorded a podcast interview about ethical tech development. He stood in front of a crowd of 500 people at a tech conference and was introduced as one of the most promising young minds in clean energy today. And yet the hospital room never left his thoughts. The truth was, Ethan didn't feel anger toward his father. Not anymore. He didn't feel the same sting he once did when remembering those cold words or the absence of validation. What he felt now was something else. Detachment. He had spent so long fighting to be seen, to be understood, to be heard. And now, having earned all those things elsewhere, he realized how little of it had ever come from home. And that was the hardest part to accept. He didn't hate his father, but he didn't need him either. One night, just after 11 o'clock, he walked through the quiet Palo Alto streets with his jacket pulled tight and his thoughts louder than the wind. He sat alone on a park bench near the lab, watching the distant lights of the city and wondering if not going back made him a coward. But it didn't feel like fear. It felt like choice. He had already made peace with who he was. What he hadn't yet made peace with was who his father had chosen to be all those years. A few days later, Claire met him at the lab. She handed him a thick envelope and said, "You're going to want to read this." It was a printed letter from a school in Texas. A teacher had written a full page about how Ethan's story had inspired her students to build their own small energy-saving devices for a science fair. Photos of 8th graders holding their homemade prototypes were clipped to the back. "They want to send it to you officially," Claire said, "but I thought you should see it first." Ethan stared at the photos, not with pride, but with a quiet, almost distant wonder. The ripple of his story had reached places he couldn't have imagined, and still, the part of him that used to sit invisible at the dinner table couldn't quite grasp it. That night, he opened a blank message in the family chat. He typed, "I got your call. I hope he's okay." He stared at the message for several minutes, then deleted it. Instead, he sent nothing, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood what healing looked like. Not rushing back to the place that hurt him, not trying to fix people who never tried to understand him, but choosing every day to keep building a life where he was no longer defined by them. It was 6 months later when Ethan finally returned, not because someone insisted, not because guilt wore him down, not even because of the lingering memory of a message or a call. He returned because he chose to, and choice, that single act of autonomy, was the one thing that had been taken from him too many times before. The flight landed just past noon. The city looked the same from the window, gray and familiar, its skyline modest, its rhythm slower than the pulse he had become accustomed to in California. The car that picked him up wasn't a rented black SUV or a corporate shuttle, just a modest rideshare, silent and uneventful, its driver unaware of the quiet weight his passenger carried. Ethan didn't go straight to the house. He asked to be dropped off a few blocks away, near the old community center. He wanted to walk, feel the streets under his shoes again, past the parks and sidewalks where he used to imagine a life far away. The wind was colder than he remembered, sharper, but he didn't pull his coat tighter. He let it bite. He stopped once in front of the convenience store, the same one from his early prototyping days. The awning was faded now, the lights flickering inside. He remembered standing there with barely enough money to buy coffee and copper wire. Now, his name was attached to a growing company, his device used in homes across 4 states, with pending contract in Europe and South America. But none of that was on his face as he turned onto his family street. The house came into view slowly. It hadn't changed much. The same porch, the same small front yard, the same worn shutters. He stood at the edge of the driveway for several seconds before walking up. The door was partially open. His mother answered before he could knock. She didn't say his name. She didn't cry. She simply stepped aside, silently inviting him in. The living room felt smaller than he remembered, dimmer, or maybe he had simply grown. Noah was the first to speak. "You came." Ethan smiled slightly. "Yeah." The boy hugged him, awkward but honest. Ethan's hand lingered on his brother's back just long enough to answer the question that hadn't been asked. Emily appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. No snark, just a quiet, stunned nod. "You look different." "So, do you," Ethan replied. His mother gestured toward the hallway. "He's awake." Ethan walked the path he had once taken 100 times, each step heavier now. His father was lying in bed, thin, eyes half closed, the oxygen line resting against his cheek. He looked older, not in years, in weight, in wear. The kind of aging that happens when time is no longer a resource, but a countdown. When Richard opened his eyes and saw his son, there was no dramatic shift in posture, no sudden burst of emotion, just a pause, a breath, a subtle nod of recognition. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, voice raspier than Ethan expected. "I almost didn't." "You still angry?" Ethan shook his head. "No." "Still proving me wrong?" Ethan sat down beside the bed. "No, I stopped needing to." Richard looked at the ceiling, then back at his son. "You went too far to ever be called useless." Ethan didn't smile, not out of coldness, but because the moment didn't ask for it. "I was never useless," he said. "I know," Richard whispered. "I just didn't know how to see it." They sat in silence, not the silence that divided people, the kind that only exists when both no apology can rewrite history and no victory can erase its wounds, but also the kind of silence that doesn't need to. Ethan stayed only for an hour. He didn't unpack, didn't settle. He wasn't there to return. He was there to look at the place he had grown out of and know with certainty that he had. As he stepped back outside, Susan followed him to the porch. "Will you come back again?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but not to stay." She nodded. "You're doing something good, Ethan." "I know." He turned toward the street. Noah and Emily were watching from the window. Before he walked away, he glanced back once. Not for long, not with anger, just a final look. Not for closure, but for confirmation. The house would always be there. But his home? That was something he built with his own hands, far from a table where he was never heard. Inside labs where his silence became clarity. Among people who didn't need to be told he mattered to believe it. He returned to California that night. His apartment was quiet. The sky outside a deep indigo streaked with the last embers of sunset. He unpacked his bag, sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and without a second thought, went back to building the future. Because home, he had learned, isn't where you come from. It's what you choose to create. And for the first time, he had chosen his.